So thank you, François. And you have seen this little slide in François' slides. So I will talk about this broad set of issues which concern changes that are taking place in universities and other institutions preoccupied with knowledge in general. And so this is of relevance mostly to disciplines that produce data, so mostly experimental sciences, but I think it also applies in a larger way to universities in general and to scientific endeavor in general. So I will adopt a sort of medical approach to this and talk about symptoms, causes, and remedies. So let's begin with the symptoms of what has been described as a worldwide crisis in terms of science. And one of the symptoms is the fact that there seems to be an increasing prevalence of fraudulent practices. Of course, this applies mostly to disciplines, as I indicated, where you can actually fake data, for instance. But it also concerns trends that can be observed in the literature, whereby more and more studies that get published involve or report positive results, as opposed to failures to replicate or simply negative results. It also involves replicability issues, that is, once you have a good experiment, what is the likelihood that the finding can be replicated by other people in different labs? And one step further, it also involves what has been dubbed questionable research practices. That is a number of ways of looking at the data, ways of reporting the data that are not completely fraudulent, but that involve a sort of shifting of what the norm is supposed to be. And so I'll talk about these three symptoms in turn. As François indicated, I'm a psychologist, and so social psychology in particular has been particularly in the limelight insofar as fraud is concerned. I wouldn't want you to think that social psychologists are all fraudulent crackpots, but it is true that recently there's been a number of cases that have been discussed quite widely in the literature, and one of them involved the Dutch social psychologist Diederik Stapel, who was found to have faked a number of studies that nevertheless got published in prestigious journals, including Science and Nature. So what he was doing, in fact, was collecting the data himself. That's what he was telling his PhD students. And the students would get to analyze the data and compose the articles, which of course is the exact opposite of what typically happens in psychology labs, where it is the students who carry out the studies and then they analyze the data with their mentor and then both write the article. As it turns out, Stapel wasn't collecting any data at all. He was just fabricating the data on Saturday evenings in front of his computer screen. So he just imagined a study, and then a few weeks later, the data would come in, and then the students would be very happy to find that it contained all sorts of interesting positive effects, but it was all faked. This not only concerns social psychology, but also all sorts of other domains, and I'm sure that you heard about this study by this Japanese researcher who claimed to have developed a particularly cheap and efficient method of producing stem cells, which is a very difficult process. As it turns out, after a long story involving the RIKEN and all sorts of commissions and inquiries, the whole thing turned out to be faked as well. Or at least nobody could replicate this person's method. The published papers had to be retracted and so on and so forth. This also extends to domains that are closer to your field, social science in general. And so right now, if you Google this story, you will find lots of commentary about it, as the story is currently unfolding, and it involves a PhD student and named Lacour, and his mentor Green, carrying out a study a couple of years ago showing that active advocacy by gay men, for instance, can change the opinion of people about same-sex marriage in the United States. As you know, this is a major legislative issue in the States now, whether to allow same-sex marriage. And so this paper purported to show that particular methods of interacting with voters actually was successful in changing people's opinion about whether same-sex marriage should be law or not. And so it was a paper that got published in Science, was very well received for different sorts of reasons, in part because there's quite a bit of advocacy around this issue. And it just recently came to be the case that the co-author, the senior author on the paper, Green, decided to write Science and ask that the paper be retracted. And the reason was that the PhD student wasn't able to produce the raw data, basically. So he claimed to have carried out surveys and so on and so forth, but the raw data was nowhere to be found. And so he started suspecting his PhD student to have faked the study and asked Science to retract the paper. Science hasn't retracted the paper yet. This is really unfolding right now. And everybody is waiting for a sort of account by Lacour of what happened. But presumably, everybody expects the paper will be retracted, and Lacour, who was all set to get a tenured faculty position at Princeton, well, Lacour's career is probably in trouble after this. The person who holds the record for retracted articles is this Japanese anesthesiologist who is the author of many hundreds of papers, including 172 papers that ended up being retracted, which is incredible. Yeah? So this was about fraud. There's more and more cases of fraud that are reported, detected, discussed, and so on and so forth. But it's not just about fraud. It's about the fact, for instance, that negative results, as the title of this paper by somebody who's been very active in this particular domain, Fanelli, that the fact is that negative results are disappearing from most disciplines and countries. What does this mean? Well, that in the published track record, you find fewer and fewer studies that fail to confirm the hypothesis that motivated the study in the first place. You always confirm your hypothesis. Yeah? So that's a positive result. If you fail to confirm your hypothesis, it's a negative result. And if you look at the trends, you see that over a few decades, from the early 90s to almost the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the proportion of positive results in all domains goes up from about 70% to almost 90%. Yeah? This is surprising. I mean, it's not like anything is changing in the world, right? So it's a bit bizarre that the published studies are more and more positive over time. There's no real cause that you can think of, except, of course, for publication bias and for the fact that journals seem to be more and more interested in publishing studies that have accrued positive results. Somewhat distressingly, Fanelli also showed in the same article that this trend isn't the same in all domains of science. In fact, it's more marked in social sciences, basically. If you look at physics, it goes up, but it doesn't go up as much as it does in social sciences. I was involved myself in a replication study like this, where we tried to replicate a finding from 1996, which was a beautiful finding. The finding was from social psychologist John Barge, and what he showed is that if you show people words that are associated with the stereotype of being old in a way that they do not detect exposure to these words, then they end up, the participants of your study who have been exposed to these words end up walking slower outside of the lab. It's a great finding, yes? I show you words associated with the concept of being old, and your walking speed slows down. And nobody knows what happened, but your walking speed slows down, yeah? And so Barger's notion to explain this is to say, well, unconscious exposure to these words associated with the concept of being old activates unconsciously the stereotype of being old, and the activation of this stereotype has detectable behavioral effects. You walk a little bit slower, you speak a little bit slower maybe, and so on and so forth. So it's a perfect example of what has been called behavioral priming. And I won't tell you the whole story, but we tried to replicate this study. And surprisingly, this study, which has been cited thousands of times, was carried out in 1996, and there wasn't a single replication of this study since then. Yeah? So 25 years go by, almost, and you cannot find a successful replication of this study. But I heard that many people try to replicate the study, but fail to actually get these results. But that also means they couldn't publish the data, because editors are not interested in negative findings. They're interested in positive findings. They want new, exciting results, not failures to replicate old data. Yeah? In the meantime, the study is in all the social psychology textbooks, and it's taken to be, you know, like the Bible. This is like a major social psychology finding. So we tried to replicate this study, and we failed, and we found a very interesting alternative explanation for the findings, which is partly that the biases of the experimenter also influence what happens. Yeah? So you get the effect if people see the words, and if the experimenters expect people to walk slower when they walk out of the lab. If the experimenters expect people to walk faster when they walk out of the lab, then it doesn't work. Yeah? So it's a complicated study. But that's our failure to replicate. We managed to publish in an open access journal named PLOS One, and it instantly generated considerable discussion on all the social media, from Twitter to Facebook to Google+. The study was picked up by a well-known British blogger named Ed Yong, who wrote this piece for Discover magazine. Primed by expectations, he says, why classic psychology experiment isn't what it seemed. This was about our paper. That elicited a very angry response from the author of the original study, who complained that he hadn't had a chance to see the study in the first place, but if he had, probably our study would never have been published. And so he writes another blog entry called Nothing in the Heads, in which he attacks not only our study, but also the journal in which it was published, PLOS One, and the blogger for picking up on a stupid science story. That angers the reporter, who then composes a response. A failed replication draws a scathing personal attack from a psychology professor. John Barge replied to that, calling us angry birds this time. The blogger responded. Other people started picking up on the story, the hot and cold of priming, so the whole priming field was now up for discussion. Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, but is a psychologist, got in this debate and composed an open letter. Barge replied again, priming effects replicate just fine, thanks. They don't, let me tell you. And then finally, Ed Yong published this article in Nature, Replication Studies Bad Copy, and the study is, the story is unfolding, ongoing, but it prompted a major debate in social psychology, particularly when combined with these fraud stories from Diederik Stapel and other well-known social psychologists about research practices in general, and why it's almost impossible to publish negative results. Yeah? And if you look at this field, in fact, after this, after our paper came out, there's now a number of articles, all published in open access journals, that have likewise shown that some of these behavioral priming effects are just difficult to replicate. So why is that? Or all the original authors fraudsters or people who cannot do research? Well, of course, no, it's a lot more complicated than that. But this discussion also generated a sort of close look by many authors into what is now called questionable research practices. How do these How are the studies carried out? Do they truly respect statistical orthodoxy, for instance? Is data collection being done the way it's supposed to be, and so on and so forth? And so that generated quite a few papers where people attempted to figure out what people do, what scientists do, that they're not really supposed to do. Yeah? So it's a sort of gray area. And if you look in psychology, for instance, there's quite a few of these practices that people recognize they have themselves engaged in, or of course, identify in their competitors. Everybody else is doing questionable research practices, yeah. Maybe I'm not, but everybody else is, yeah. But the self-admittance rate is higher than 0. So people had some honesty in these surveys, which of course were anonymous. But so, for instance, here is a number of such questionable research practices, such as failing to report all dependent measures, collecting more data after seeing whether results were significant, never supposed to do that, failing to report all conditions of an experiment, stopping data collection after achieving the desired result, rounding down p-values. The p statistic is this value which indicates whether your effect is significant or not, and so on and so forth. And you can see the self-admission rate and the estimates of prevalence. And it's, some of these are fairly big. 78%, for instance, failing to report all dependent measures. 42% failing to report all conditions. Rounding down p-values, 39%. This is huge. You're not supposed to do that. So when you carry out these studies about questionable research practices, in fact, you do find that many people engaged, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, in such questionable research practices, which of course increase the likelihood that whatever you publish will be positive and then more likely to be accepted. Here's another study that was carried out in Belgium, and I will skip over it because it's basically the same sort of finding. If you look at the details of how statistical tests are carried out in psychology, you also find all sorts of funny patterns, which are not supposed to be the case. So if you take a well-known journal in the field, such as Psychological Science, for instance, and you look at the published studies, you find that the distribution of p-values around 0.05, which is the threshold under which a study is significant and over which it isn't, has this bizarre distribution with many studies that report a p-value which is just below the threshold, 0.05. Yeah, that's 49% or something like that. Yeah, and very few studies that report non-significant results about 0.05. But this data point here, that's really strange. If you look at the p statistic with the eyes of a statistician, it should be a sort of, it's a distribution that doesn't have this shape at all. Yeah, if you run automated experiments many times, you don't get this distribution. This is highly suggestive that people are engaging in questionable research practices, such as stopping data collection when they get the p-value to be just under 0.5, and then that's what they publish. You know? But this is not appropriate from a statistical point of view. You cannot say whether the effect that was observed is a true effect or not. And so, when you get outside of fraudulent practices, like I discussed initially, and into this area of questionable research practices, it really is a sort of slippery slope. Yeah, you have all sorts of practices that are used that you shouldn't engage in if you want to be completely correct in terms of statistical analysis, for instance. And it's a real issue whether people engaged in these practices knowingly or not. So those were the symptoms. Now, what are the causes of all this? Why is this changing? Why do we see so many more studies reporting positive results than would be expected based on chance, or that would be expected based on what happened in the past? The data isn't changing. Well, I think media hype, the interest that the media now takes into scientific research, is a contributor. There's also shifting notions of truth, and I will get to that. There's another factor, I think, which is subsumed by the title that Ginsburg gave to his excellent book titled The Fall of the Faculty. And then there's publication pressure, which is where this connects with bibliometrics and the H-index and et cetera, et cetera. So first, media hype. All these data, as we saw through my replication study, now get picked up by the social media and by the press. And so, for instance, again, to take the social psychology studies, you have hundreds of sexy findings that are amplified by the media. So, you know, all sorts of effects that are barely plausible in the first place, such as the fact that subliminal exposure to fast food logos makes you impatient, or that incidental exposure to the smell of a cleaning fluid makes you more self-conscious of cleanliness when eating. Sitting on a hard chair makes you a better negotiator. Holding a warm versus a cold cup changes your impressions of someone you meet. Or incidental exposure to a briefcase versus a backpack makes you better at playing Trivial Pursuit. These are all actual results published in social psychology journals. Some of them work out. This is not to say all these subliminal effects don't work out, but some of them don't, as we saw. Yeah? But the point here is to say, well, all of this now, and this is unlike what was the case 20 years ago, gets picked up by the media and discussed and exposed and so on. And so scientists all of a sudden get a lot of exposure. Everybody talks about the new study in the New York Times, in other great journals, and so on and so forth. Yeah? And so now you have hundreds of reports boasting these results and showcasing them, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a problem, because when scientists or scholars in general interact with journalists, you know, the question you get is always, can you make it simpler? You know, you say, maybe you got the effect, or maybe this is suggestive. We use conditionals, yeah? We're careful about what we say. And they ask, can you make it simpler? So after 10 or so requests, well, you know, you sort of end up making it simpler, particularly if there's a carrot hanging in front of you. You know, my work is going to be covered in the New York Times. Okay, so I'll make the story a little bit simpler. And then you make it a little bit simpler, and then, you know, you sort of have this vicious circle, in fact, where the message that reported the actual results that you obtain, which are full of caution and you know, conditionals, actually get simplified to the point that they're no longer corresponding to anything that is truthful. Yeah? Einstein said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I fear that we're sort of getting in a zone where we make things too simple to capture the complexity of what it is that scientists and scholars do. Further, truth is no longer what it used to be. As we know, today everybody is an expert. There's thousands of competing sources on the internet. We are witness to big fabricated controversies supported by political or ideological agendas. Think of climate change discussions. Think about discussions concerning intelligent design, and so on and so forth. And all of this results in a pervasive and continuing confusion between opinion and fact. Yeah? It's really become harder today to distinguish between opinion and fact. Here's just a few examples of that, or actually one example. Here's this website, you know, so you type truth in science. So your website, truth in science. What is truth in science? Well, truth in science is an advocacy website emanating from a biblical studies group. You know, and so it says here, Christian education must make every effort to reconnect the scientific thought and with the biblical worldview. The Truth in Science curriculum provides a fascinating exposure to scientific concepts that also honor our Creator. Yeah? This is called Truth in Science. Yeah? Okay, I'll let you consider the implications of that and what it means for something to be true. Yeah? Okay, second factor, the fall of the faculty. Ginsburg wrote this beautiful book, Benjamin Ginsburg, describing the process of corporatization, in fact, of the American university, basically. And this is, I think, a terrible development where not only is it the case that there are fewer and fewer permanent faculty members in universities, particularly when you consider the ratio between permanent faculty and administrative staff, basically. But also the faculty itself is now composed essentially, and more so, of adjunct professors in the United States that have no political power. Yeah, they're paid hourly wages to teach 1 or 2 classes, and they do not sit on administration councils. They barely make up anything in terms of curriculum construction and so on and so forth. So the power of the faculty and the importance of the faculty in the university has declined precipitously over the past decades. Here's the situation, for instance, these ratios represent the ratio between permanent faculty, tenured faculty positions in a number of public colleges and administrative staff. And you can see that this ratio keeps going down between 1990 and 2012, yeah? Sometimes quite a bit, you know, like here. Yeah. So universities are hiring more and more layers of administrators and creating more and more administrative positions. Those administrators are paid now insane salaries that are many multiples of what even the best paid faculty, the best paid professors earn. Yeah, sometimes in the millions of dollars for American presidents of American universities. And at the same time, the faculty's position in these institutions is declining. Yeah? It has less and less power to exert political change in their own institutions. Yeah? This is professors. By the same token, and on the sidelines, there's an entire business, of course, that has developed around universities and which is reinforced by bibliometrics, H-indexes, rankings, and so on and so forth. So you have entire journals now which are dedicated to what they call the university business. Yeah? How to monetize students' grants, how to sell the grants that, well, the loans that students receive in financial products that are highly reminiscent of the housing bubble in 2008. So you have these highly complex financial products now that are being sold based on the debts incurred by students. Yeah? And so you can buy this. You can buy student debt in, you know, from the UK or the States. It's a very good return on investment. Yeah? Is this what universities are about? I'm not so sure. So you have, you know, I mean, entire journals dedicated to strategies for success amongst administrators and so on and so forth. Here is Ronald Baker, who used to be president of a major American university, writing in one of these journals. Here's what he says about higher education. He says, higher education today should be understood as a strategic investment of resources to produce benefits for business and industry by leveraging fiscal and human capital to produce a direct, immediate, and positive financial return on those investments. You know, when I read this, yeah, I don't even know where to begin, you know? But this guy's talking about science, as he's talking about scholarship. He's talking about what we do in our institutions, yeah? I was exposed recently to beautiful work by Moretti and Pestre, who analyzed, for instance, from a linguistic point of view, the language used in World Bank reports between 1950, I think, to today. Very interesting. They call it bank speak. And what transpires from this linguistic analysis is that the reports issued by the World Bank in the 1950s were mostly about facts. You know, the bank invested in this development in, you know, Congo or something like that, or you know, experts went to consult with the Chinese bank to foster the development of mining, the mining business in South China, or facts, you know, mostly facts. Today, it's full of this sort of corporate bank speak, as they call it. You know, the language itself has changed. It has moved from the passive voice to the from the active voice to the passive voice, and there's there's all sorts of interesting developments in terms of multiple objectives, and you get into this bank speed, which is, I mean, basically business bullshit, right? Very interesting. The same thing is happening with universities. But the ideal that we all pursue, I think, is a monastic ideal. Yeah, it's knowledge for knowledge's sake. It doesn't have to be for anything. It's just, a reflection of our intellectual curiosity and our wish to contribute to expanding knowledge in the world. And this is a picture that is an ideal, but it's becoming more and more of an ideal today. And it's a great worry, I think, for the pursuit of knowledge in general. Because when scientific research is taken to be a business, as we have seen is the case, well, then knowledge becomes a product. And universities, in that perspective, produce knowledge just as car factories produce cars, or chicken factories produce chicken, and so on and so forth. But if knowledge is a product, then it is something that you can measure and quantify. How much is there of the product? How much it costs to produce it? Who produces the most? How can we make the process more efficient? This is in part what rankings and bibliometrics is about. Yeah, we need bibliometrics. I'm not saying away with the H-index. I think it's very useful, but it's the way we use these measures, for instance, that is problematic, in the sense that they support this perspective on universities, which is now developing. And in fact, I think it is a complete reversal of priorities, a tectonic shift in values. Instead of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, we are now supposed to produce knowledge to increase university rankings and to promote our own careers. And so this sets up problematically a sort of elaborate rat race system that is a system of incentives that are put in place to support this model. We've seen this with research assessment exercises, publication rewards. In some institutions, you get paid 10,000 euros if you publish a paper in Nature or Science. There's now a trafficking going on of negotiating second-order spots on some articles. Yeah, if I know that I'll get paid 10,000 euros if I publish a paper in Nature, then maybe my chances of publishing the paper in Nature will be increased if I associate with myself with this well-known world expert in my domain. Yeah. How can I get him to be involved? Well, he gets 5,000 of my 10,000. Does that make any sense? No, it doesn't. But, this is happening. So the point is, when it's set up as a game, when there's a system in place that is objective, defined by criteria, quantifiable items, then people will try to game this system, basically, and it's happening. When you know that publishing your paper in Science will grant you tenure, and that all you need to do to get your paper in Science is to remove one or two pesky participants, well, you have to have a pretty strong moral compass not to do it, yeah? Nobody will know. It's click, click on your computer on a Sunday evening, yeah? But remember, even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat, yeah? This is an American actress who said that. I think it's a pretty good quote, yeah? But this argument, that's exactly what's happening with this gay advocacy or same-sex marriage advocacy paper. Yeah, the guy Lacour was set up to get a job at Princeton, which of course he is incredibly more likely to get if he ends up managing to publish the paper in Science, which he did. But now the paper turns out to be fraudulent, or at least problematic. You can see where the story goes, yeah? Probably, that's my guess, but we don't know. He's going to reply at the end of the week to the critiques. Probably he made up the data, or he played around with the data so much that it was a nice story that Science was interested in, and that's how he got the paper in Science. But the study doesn't work out. It's not true. It was an interesting story, but it's not true. So I think this is a perverse effect of the eruption of this corporate culture in our realm, basically in the realm of universities and well, scholarship in general. The problem with too little pressure, because of course that's something that the academic world has been accused of. Yeah, you have all these professors sitting there and they publish one paper every 10 years. What do? We're wasting public money here. Yeah, we're supporting all these people, and working on, domains that nobody is interested in, like, coins by Alexander the Great, etc. Who wants to pay for that? Yeah. Now it begins. Yeah. So you have these freeloaders amongst the population of active scholars. Yeah. Then you have a good number of active scholars, and then a small, tiny bit of people who are pathological fraudsters. Yeah. They've always existed. Yeah. And so now the corporation or this perspective, this business perspective on university is saying, well, you're wasting too much money here. Yeah, that's a problem. We're wasting public money. What do you do then? Well, you set up this elaborate structure of incentives, which I've explained to you. But what's the consequence of that? Well, you reduce the number of freeloaders by increasing pressure, you know, and now people have to reach certain objectives, and you have to publish that many papers a year. And if your H-index isn't that high, then maybe you won't get a promotion, and so on and so forth. So you reduce the number of freeloaders, you increase the number of active people, but dramatically you also increase the number of fraudsters. And this is a much worse problem than the one we had with the freeloaders, basically, because now you have even more public money wasted here, but you also have a potentially infected literature. You don't know what is true anymore in the published record. And regularly, you all need to look at Retraction Watch, for instance. Many of these papers get retracted, yeah? So you don't, I mean, that's a major issue. And it's a major issue you didn't have if you wasted some money supporting people who were not that active and who weren't doing much. In fact, it's the same thing with taxation, yeah? If you increase tax pressure, then your revenue ultimately declines, yeah? If I tax you at 90%, you're going to stop working, right? So this is the Laffer curve. It's exactly the same thing. We're way past this revenue maximizing point here. Yeah? And in fact, there is evidence also, again by Fanelli, about this link between perceived publication pressure and positive results. Yeah? So this is data from the United States, where what he looked at was different US states characterized by different levels of competition, basically. Of course, if you're in New York, there's lots more academic competition in your domain than if you were in Delaware or if you were in Minnesota, yeah? There's just a couple of institutions and it's a bit laid back, yeah? So does that change the proportion of positive results? Well, yes, it does. The more competition, the more positive results you get. Yeah? What it also means is that, because again, why would there be a greater likelihood of positive results in New York than in Minnesota? There isn't. It's just research. You do the same research whether you're in Minnesota or whether in New York. Yeah? What he shows here is that if you're in a more competitive state, then you're more likely to publish positive results. It also means that most of these positive results are probably false. Yeah? This is more or less the same study, so I'll just skip it. All of this has consequences, of course, including death. So there was a widely advertised study of a professor in Imperial College in London committing suicide because he was asked by his dean to make more efforts than he was doing in order to obtain grant funding. This was in the medical school, I think. And in fact, professors are set goals to achieve in terms of funding. Yeah? He couldn't take it. And so, same thing in different countries. So, what are the remedies? What is it that we can do? Well, we can change incentives. That's clearly what we need to do. But do we need incentives at all? It's also a world coming from the corporate world, in a way. There's also an issue of changing demographics and perspectives in academia. I've seen many young scholars who are completely in this corporate mindset. Yeah, they care about their career more than they care about whether they actually do something that has meaning or something that will increase knowledge. They care about their career. So maybe it's a little bit too late, but this entire system of getting promotion based on the number of articles or how much money you can get, I mean, this has to And it has to change, I think. We should correct the publication record and allow negative results to be published. And open access journals are playing a significant role in that. There's many more negative studies that get published now. There's a lot of concern and interest around replication in general and replicability. So people have talked about a replicability crisis in psychology, for instance. But there are very interesting initiatives, such as the Open Science Framework, headed by Brian Nosek, that aims to correct that, where there's great incentives to make the data public, to share everything, etc., etc. So this is what's been called this open science approach, and also post-publication peer review. You publish your paper, and then, because of the internet and all these mechanisms, it actually gets re-reviewed after it's published. Yeah? This is great. So there's public discussion about the findings of the articles. Mechanisms such as registered reports, which are also very interesting. So you submit not the entire study, but the plan of the study. So what's your hypothesis? What are you going to do? What will be your method? Yeah? That's what you submit to a journal. The journal says, yes, I find this interesting, and the study will answer your hypothesis or explore your hypothesis. I will take it. And then it commits to publishing the paper, whatever the results you end up getting may be, yeah? Regardless of whether it's positive or negative results. Of course, better statistics. I talked about p-hacking. Those methods to circumvent that issue. And finally, get priorities right. Again, we don't do research to publish. We publish because we do research. And scientific inquiry should be about finding what is true and nothing more. Yeah? In the open access movement, that's also a business in a way, yeah, gold open access. And so Science recently ran, for instance, a study showing that there are many, many journals now in the publishing world that are just predatory open access journals, yeah? And probably you have gotten requests like that, Hey, Dr. Cleeremans, I saw your work cited on Google Scholar, and I thought that you would be interested in publishing an article in our new journal of cognitive psychology. And then it turns out it's a complete scam, I mean, they ask you to pay 3,000 euros, which many gold open access journals that are correct also ask you to do. But then it turns out that the publisher is in Singapore, and then some other, the bank is in the States, and there isn't any real editorial staff, so it's not a real journal, it's a scam. There's thousands of scam open access journals like that, but there's also a good number of very solid green or gold open access journals that are doing a good service to the community by publishing negative results. That is, they look at how the study was carried out, methods only, and they publish regardless of whether it's positive or not. And this, I think, is a very good development. But as you see, universities are fraught with corporate interests. The publishing world is full of corporate interests. Scientists themselves are engaged in fraud. And so I'm not sure where you can do research correctly anymore. Perhaps academies are a good location to pursue research that is aimed at accruing knowledge for the sake of knowledge and nothing else. Thank you.